With Disney's recent purchase of Fox, we're all well aware that sooner or later, the X-Men will make their debut in the MCU. But the mystery is, when we do see them, which characters will we be introduced to first? So with that in mind, I thought it would be fun to go over my picks for which X-Men characters Marvel should have on the team for their first X-Men film. Okay, without further ado, the first character I'm going to put on this team is Cyclops. Cyclops is the definitive leader of the X-Men for me. I know a lot of X-Men media has tried to push Wolverine as the leader of recent, but that's just something that feels so wrong to me. The leader in these new movies should without a doubt be Cyclops. To me, you just can't do the X-Men without having Cyclops involved in at least some way. Cyclops as a character was done so dirty in the Fox movies, it's actually insane. Dude gets sidelined hard AF in the first trilogy, only to die off screen. And then when the second iteration comes around, he's too young to really feel like the leader that Cyclops is, especially considering how those movies tried to push Mystique as the leader of the X-Men so much. At the moment, I'm in the middle of reading the Jonathan Hickman era of X-Men books, and Cyclops is by far one of the most interesting characters to read. Bro is an extremely compelling character to follow, and I'm confident that Marvel would do an elite job at adapting him. Due to all of this, I strongly believe that Cyclops is the most deserving mutant to appear on the big screen in Marvel's first X-Men film. Cyclops really deserves a good big screen adaptation. I cannot stress that enough. I cannot stress enough how much I think that. The second mutant that I would have Marvel adapt onto the big screen is Nightcrawler. I've chosen Nightcrawler for a very specific purpose. I feel it's extremely important to have at least one X-Men member that doesn't look human. A notable plot point that people question in regards to why humans hate mutants is, why do these people hate mutants but not superheroes like Captain America and Spider-Man? And while one answer to this question is that characters like Spider-Man and Captain America are a result of a science experiment / accident, while the appearance of mutants is a natural occurrence that shows Homo sapiens are on their way out. Another is that some of these mutants blatantly do not look like human beings. There are plenty of examples of mutants that have disturbing features, and while Nightcrawler himself is not disturbing to look at, I feel he would fill this purpose of "that's not a human being" very well. After all, he was the mutant in the famous panel where Senator Kelly asks, "You dare call this thing human?" in the story, God Loves, Man Kills. This is something that I feel would help to set the tone of the X-Men greatly. That mutants are indeed a race that are discriminated against. Allowing the audience to grow attached to a mutant that isn't capable of blending in and hiding amongst humanity and as a result is discriminated against will allow for a good story and make the audience sympathize with the X-Men's cause. Nightcrawler was also just one of my favorite X-Men, to be honest. I remember seeing an episode of Wolverine and the X-Men that focused on Nightcrawler meeting Scarlet Witch and exploring Genosha, which instantly made him one of my favorite characters. He was also my favorite part of both X-Men 2 and X-Men Apocalypse. His friendship with Wolverine is also something that is extremely fun to read. I put a wholesome panel on screen where both Nightwing and Wolverine are preparing to sacrifice themselves for an extremely important mission. They do get resurrected later, but that's not the main focus here. And in this panel, Wolverine essentially confesses to Kurt that he's not really sure he's a good man, and he's afraid that when he does enter the afterlife, heaven won't be what awaits him. Kurt, however, reassures him that when Logan does pass from this earthly plane, that he will be there waiting for him in heaven. The third mutant that I would put on this team would be Storm. Storm is a character that, until very recently, I actually wasn't a massive fan of. I knew she had been involved in an insane amount of X-Men stories and has actually been one to lead the X-Men before in the comics, but put simply, after delving into X-Men comics myself, Storm is a massive badass. It's actually unreal how cool this character is. Storm is another character like Cyclops that I feel the Fox movies didn't quite do justice, but is not at the same level as to how Cyclops was handled. To put it simply, the Fox version of Storm just feels like a really toned down version of Storm. She isn't as cool and more or less suffers the same fate as everyone else in those films that isn't named either Charles, Eric, or Logan, in that they spend most of their time being pushed to the side for these other bigger characters that the studio wants to focus on more. Storm in the comics is actually also the Queen of Wakanda, as she's married to the Black Panther, which is something I'm not sure the MCU will touch upon due to Chadwick Boseman's recent death, but it's still an option for them if they wanted to adapt that part of the comics in some way, however that may be. So while I will admit that Storm is a character that I don't have a lot of super specific reasons for why I would include her in the first X-Men film, I will say having her in the first film is something that just feels right to me. She is a very good character, and I'm sure that Marvel would utilize her to the fullest extent, so I am going to include her on this team for the first film. The fourth mutant I would choose is Kitty Pryde. Marvel has shown with how they handled the introduction of Spider-Man to the MCU that they'd like to have their iterations of characters be noticeably different to what previous studios have done with the said character, actively trying to avoid just retelling the same stories that other films have tackled, with the skipping of a typical Spider-Man origin movie being the key thing that shows this. Kitty is a character that, while she was in the Fox movies, she really wasn't an important character in those movies at all. I would actually consider the Fox version of Kitty Pryde to be one of the most forgettable X-Men members of their movies. Having Kitty on the team and being a prominent member would help Marvel to stop their X-Men films from feeling the same as the Fox movies. Kitty being a younger character during the start of her comic years would also allow Marvel to use her as an audience surrogate. She could be a new student or a member of the X-Men that is inexperienced, giving Marvel a natural way to have various things be explained on screen for the audience. Fox themselves used this approach with Wolverine in the first X-Men movie, having him be initially untrustworthy of the X-Men and taking everything as a joke, and having scenes where Professor Xavier explains what the school and the X-Men are to Wolverine. Even if Marvel didn't want to use Kitty in this way as a younger, newer character, Kitty is still a very compelling character. My favourite X-book so far has actually been the Marauders to my surprise, which Kitty Pryde is in fact the main character of. Following her throughout that book is actually really fun, and again, just like I said with Storm and Cyclops and Nightcrawler, I'm convinced that Marvel could adapt this character and use her extremely well. And finally, the last mutant that I would have on its X-Men roster is Jean Grey. To me, Cyclops and Jean are a packaged item. It would feel wrong to introduce Scott without also introducing Jean. I'm aware that there have been long periods of time in the X-Men books where Jean is dead and Scott has either been alone or had other partners, but for a movie adaptation, I really do feel that the two characters should share the big screen. Not having Wolverine in this film would also allow for Jean as a character to be explored more without having her primary story purpose to be a love interest to Logan. I do know that the later Fox films had movies where this was done, but again, in the same way that young Cyclops didn't quite manage to capture the mature leader aspect of the character for me, I would say the same thing applied to Jean Grey. Another reason why I want Jean is because I really want to see a good adaptation of the Phoenix Saga. But if I'm honest, this is something I'm not really sure I would see Marvel doing. Considering how Marvel has previously shown they don't like retelling stories that other studios have done, and considering how Fox has made 2 movies adapting the storyline, I don't think it's something that Marvel would be keen on doing. I actually am going to make a video on how I think Marvel could make a Dark Phoenix Saga movie while keeping it distinctly different from the Fox versions, so if that's something you're interested in, make sure to subscribe. Regardless, having the Phoenix in the MCU could allow for so many different types of stories and ideas. The main one that comes to mind for me would be an adaptation of the Phoenix 5 storyline, a story where the Phoenix powers are split amongst 5 different mutants and actually ends with the death of Charles Xavier. Now I'm just going to quickly go over some honourable mentions. The first 2 are characters that I'd love to see in the second X-Men film, that being Wolverine and Rogue. Wolverine is Wolverine, I don't think I need to elaborate much past that, and Rogue has always been one of my favourite X-Men, so I'd love to see her on the big screen as well. I would also love to see Emma Frost at some point. She's also one of my favourite X-Men characters and has been really fun to follow and read. In my head, she would appear during a 3rd X-Men film that contains a Phoenix Saga adaptation where she would initially be introduced as a villain alongside the Hellfire Club, just like she was in the comics, and then by the 4th film, she would have changed and joined the X-Men. But anyway guys, that was my picks for what characters I think Marvel should use on the team for the first X-Men film. Going over them again real quick, we had Cyclops, Nightcrawler, Storm, Kitty Pryde, and Jean Grey. Let me know what you guys think, if you agreed with my picks or whatever changes you'd like to make. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.